She had been invisible for so long that she'd almost forgotten the feeling of being seen. And then Adrian Vale walked into the manor and looked straight at her like she was the only real thing in the room. Not with desire, not with pity. With the kind of attention a man gives a locked door he's already decided to open. Mirelle Rowan didn't know his name yet. Didn't know what he carried in that leather satchel, or what the silver insignia on his chest meant, or why every noble in the hall suddenly straightened their spine when he passed. She only knew that something shifted in the air the moment he entered, the way pressure changes before a storm breaks, and that Selene Vorath, the most dangerous woman Mirelle had ever known, went pale as winter bone. Whatever he was here for, it was going to tear this place apart. Stay until the end, because the girl they buried in service was about to be found. Shut. The cold came early to Valedorn that year. By the second week of the 10th month, frost had already crept into the seams of the manor's stone walls, worming through old mortar and exhaling into the servants' corridor in pale, thin clouds. Mirelle felt it before she saw it each morning, that first breath when she left her pallet, the way her lungs tightened like they were bracing for something. She had slept in the East Wing's lower corridor for 3 years, on a straw pallet wedged between the linen cabinet and the water barrel, and she had learned to read the manor's moods the same way farmers read sky, the temperature of a hallway, the sound a door made when it closed, the specific silence that meant Lady Selene was already awake and already displeased. This morning, the silence was the wrong kind. Mirelle dressed quickly, her fingers working the worn buttons of her gray service dress by memory, the fabric so washed thin in places that the cold passed through it like she wasn't wearing anything at all. She tied her hair back, tucking the loose ends under the cloth cap all household servants were required to wear in Selene's presence. The lady had once thrown a decorative urn at a girl whose braid she deemed distracting, and she wrapped the old scarf around her neck and shoulders before stepping into the corridor proper. The scarf was the one thing she allowed herself. It had belonged to her mother, or what she understood of her mother, a woman who had died when Mirelle was young enough that the memory lived more in sensation than in image. The smell of something warm, the sound of a low melody, the feeling of a hand pressed flat against a small back, not urgently, not desperately, but with that particular steadiness that said, "I am here and I will not move." The scarf was faded to the color of old cream, its embroidered border worn down to near nothing in most places, and it smelled now only of the manor's damp stone and the cedar sachets Mirelle tucked into the linen cabinet. But she kept it. She'd kept it through 3 different postings, and one night in the road between them, wrapped in it against the cold, telling herself it was practical. It wasn't practical, it was the only thing she owned that no one had assigned her. She moved through the east corridor toward the kitchen without making a sound. This, too, was practiced. The 3rd flagstone from the left outside the wine pantry had a loose edge that chimed if you landed on it wrong. The door to the scullery hung slightly off its lower hinge and scraped the floor if open more than halfway. The back staircase had a banister that would creak under any weight applied to its right side. Mirelle navigated all of it in near darkness, her feet finding the safe path from memory, and she had never once been able to articulate, not even to herself, whether she moved this way out of efficiency or out of the older, quieter instinct that said, "Be small, be quiet, take up no space a person might notice and resent." The kitchen was already lit when she arrived. Hessa, the head cook, stood at the central work table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her gray-streaked hair pinned under a cap that had seen better decades, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been doing the same impossible thing for too long and had made peace with it. "You're late," Hessa said, without looking up from the bread dough she was punching. "I'm 3 minutes early," Mirelle said. Lady Selene moved the morning schedule. "Guests arriving tonight, which means the midday meal gets pushed up, which means I need those herbs from the garden before the light goes flat, and you need to have the formal dining room laid before the 2nd bell." Hessa finally looked at her. Her eyes were not unkind, but they carried the specific restraint of a woman who had learned not to invest too much in things that tended to disappear. "And she's in a mood." There was never a time Selene Vorath was not in a mood. But there were gradations. Mirelle had catalogued them over 3 years the way a naturalist catalogues weather patterns. Not out of fascination, but out of the survival imperative of anyone who needed to predict when the sky was about to fall on them. "What kind?" Mirelle asked. Hessa pressed her lips together. "The kind where she made Dara redo the flower arrangements in the front hall 3 times and then swept them off the table herself." Mirelle absorbed this. She moved to her station without further conversation, pulling her apron from the hook, her mind already running forward through the sequence of tasks the day required. The dining room, the guest linens, the silver service, which needed to be polished, and the manor had exactly one person responsible for polishing it, which was Mirelle, because Selene had decided at some point that Mirelle's hands were too rough for serving food directly to noble guests, and this was a more suitable use of them. It was not a demotion that had ever been stated plainly. It had simply accumulated, one reassignment at a time, each one individually explainable, each one in the aggregate a portrait of something more deliberate. She didn't think about it. Thinking about it was a luxury she had learned not to afford herself. By the time the first bell rang, the dining room was half laid and the silver was done. By the time the second bell rang, Mirelle had carried 2 armloads of fresh linens from the laundry, set the formal table for 14, replenished the oil in 6 sconces, and filled the water pitchers from the well in 2 trips, because the third girl assigned to water duty had quietly vanished somewhere between the kitchen and the courtyard, and no one had gone looking for her yet. She was on her 3rd trip back from the herb garden, her hands cold and her breath visible, when she heard Selene's voice coming from the formal parlor. "Absolutely not. I will not have her serving at the table tonight. She looks like she belongs in a barn." A pause. A second voice, Lena, the house steward, cautious and placating. "My lady, we're short on—" "I don't care what we're short on. Find someone who doesn't look like they've spent the last week sleeping in a drainage ditch. Or dress her in something that covers the disaster from neck to floor." "I want her invisible tonight, Lena." "Invisible or absent? I don't particularly care which." Mirelle stood in the corridor outside the parlor door, herbs in both arms, her face completely still. This was the thing about Selene Vorath that most people who hadn't lived under her roof didn't understand. It wasn't the cruelty itself that carved into you. Cruelty was loud, cruelty was dramatic, cruelty was a thing you could brace against. What Selene had perfected over years of practice was something quieter and more precise. The art of diminishment, of making a person feel like the space they occupied was borrowed, temporary, and slightly embarrassing for everyone involved. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to throw things, though she did that too when the occasion suited her. She simply needed to talk about you while you were standing close enough to hear, in the tone one used for discussing furniture that needed replacing. Mirelle moved past the parlor door without stopping. Her face stayed neutral, her spine stayed straight. She was 18 years old and she had been living in service since she was 15, and before that she had lived in 2 other households, and before that she had lived somewhere else. She didn't have clear memory of the somewhere else, only fragments. A stone floor, cold air, the lullaby. She thought about the lullaby sometimes, not often. When she did, she pushed the thought away quickly, the same way you looked away from something that could undo you if you looked at it too long. It was her mother's song. Her mother was gone. That was the beginning and end of it, and anything more complex than that was a direction she had learned not to walk in. The afternoon arrived in the way winter afternoons arrived in the northern estates, fast and sudden, the light going amber and then gray between one task and the next, the temperature dropping another degree every hour. The guest carriages began arriving before dark. From the scullery window, Mirelle could see them rolling up the north drive, 4 of them, polished wood and silver fittings, attended by outriders in livery she didn't recognize. Merchants, she assumed at first. Selene's household attracted a specific class of guest, wealthy, well-connected, and deeply invested in maintaining the social arrangements that kept people like Selene in their current position and people like Mirelle in theirs. Then she saw the insignia on the 5th carriage. She almost missed it. She had been carrying a stack of serving plates toward the warming cabinet, and the window was above and behind her, and she only caught it because she turned to check the light. But she saw it clearly. A silver eagle with wings spread, mounted on a field of dark blue. She didn't know precisely what it meant, But she had grown up in the north of Valedorn, and the north of Valedorn knew certain things the way blood knew the body it moved through. In the marrow, without needing to be taught. That insignia meant crown authority, not the Duke's household guard, not a local marshal's office, something that answered directly to the capital. Mirelle set the plates in the warming cabinet and did not think about the carriage again. It was not her business. Nothing about tonight was her business except the tasks assigned to her, which Hessa had confirmed before the afternoon meal. She was to stay in the kitchen and the scullery for the duration of the dinner service, invisible or absent, as directed. She was invisible. She was very good at it. By the time the dinner service was underway, the kitchen had the particular organized chaos of a house that had prepared for an event and was now managing the fact that events never proceeded according to preparation. The third course came back to the kitchen twice because Selene had decided on a different presentation. A serving boy dropped a ladle and scalded his wrist and spent 10 minutes stifling tears while Hessa wrapped it without slowing her pace. The wine requested by one of the guests turned out to be a vintage the cellar was one bottle short of, which required a creative solution involving a different vintage and a strategic relabeling that Mirelle was fairly certain qualified as fraud, but kept that observation to herself. She worked. She stayed near the scullery. She kept her head down and her movements efficient, and she listened, the way she always listened. Not intently, not conspicuously, just with the low, constant attention of someone who understood that information was the only asset available to someone who had no other kind. What she heard through the service corridor in fragments told her that the man who had arrived with the crown insignia was named Adrian Vale, that he held the rank of Crown Marshal, which was not the same as a regional marshal. It was a designation appointed directly by the capital, given to men who investigated matters the Crown considered sensitive enough not to trust to local authority, that he had arrived not on a social visit, but on official business, that the official business had something to do with rumors of mismanagement among the northern noble houses, or possibly something related to the redistribution of land grants from the previous decade. The fragments she was catching in the corridor were incomplete enough that she couldn't construct the full picture. She also heard that Lady Selene had gone from her earlier mood into something different, something she recognized as more dangerous than ordinary displeasure. Fear. She'd only seen it a handful of times. Selene was not a woman who wore vulnerability on her face. She'd had too many years of practice presenting exactly what she chose to present. But Mirelle had been in close proximity to her long enough to know the tells. The way her posture changed at the shoulders, tightening inward by a fraction only visible to someone watching for it. The quality of her smile, which became, under stress, a little too precisely maintained. A smile that was working to exist rather than existing naturally. And her voice. A register lower than usual, controlled to the point of flatness, which meant she was managing something that wanted to get out. Whatever Crown Marshal Adrian Vale represented, it had frightened Lady Selene Vorath. Mirelle filed this away and kept working. The dinner service concluded near the 9th hour of evening. The guests moved to the south drawing room, where the manor's musicians had been set up, and the kitchen began the long process of clearing and cleaning that followed any formal event. Mirelle was on her hands and knees scrubbing the hearthstone, a task assigned at the last minute by Lena, who had needed someone to do it and picked the nearest available person, when she heard footsteps in the service corridor that were wrong. Wrong in the sense that they were too deliberate, not the quick, purposeful stride of someone who knew where they were going because they'd been going there for years. These were the footsteps of someone moving through a space carefully, taking note of it, the pace of someone conducting a quiet assessment. She kept her back to the corridor and kept scrubbing. The footsteps slowed, stopped. This is the kitchen. It wasn't a question. The voice was level, without inflection. The voice of someone accustomed to stating observations that others were expected to confirm or correct. "Yes, sir," Hessa said from somewhere behind Mirelle. A pause. "The drawing room is through the main hall, second left." "I'm aware." Another pause. "I'm looking for something, a record of the household's current and former staff, census documentation, if the estate keeps it." "That'd be with the house steward," Hessa said carefully. "Lena would have it." "Lena has directed me to several different people in the last 20 minutes, none of whom have been able to locate the records she described. I'm beginning to think the records don't want to be found." Mirelle heard the deliberate quality in the statement, the implication laid in it, flat and unhurried, the way a stone is laid in a wall, one piece fitting exactly against the next. "I wouldn't know about that, sir," Hessa said. A pause. In the corner of her vision, Mirelle was aware of movement, the sense of someone turning, attention redirecting. She kept her eyes on the hearthstone, kept the cloth moving in even strokes. She had learned a long time ago that the safest thing in a room full of people with power and agendas was to be the person those people's eyes slid off. "You," the voice said. She looked up. The man standing in the service corridor entrance was not what she'd expected from the title. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected from Crown Marshal. Something louder, maybe. Something with more deliberate display. He was in his early 30s by her estimate, with a face that had been made for harder weather than a nobleman's drawing room. Not handsome in the sculpted, maintained way of the courtiers she'd served at various estates, but the kind of face that looked like it had been through a number of things and had come out on the other side still functional. He wore dark traveling clothes under an unbuttoned coat, not formal dress, which meant he had either not changed after arriving or had changed into something deliberately unpretentious. The silver eagle insignia was pinned to his coat's lapel, understated, not polished to the reflective shine the estate's own guards wore their badges. His eyes were the particular gray of winter sky just before the temperature dropped, and they were looking at her with an attention that was neither rude nor polite, simply direct, the way someone looked at a thing when they were trying to understand what it was. "How long have you been in this household service?" he asked. 3 years, sir," Mirelle said. She stayed kneeling. "You didn't stand up uninvited in front of someone with that kind of authority in a house that wasn't yours." "Before that?" She kept her voice steady. 2 years at the Harver estate in the Midlands. Before that, the Calder household in the Eastern Marches." "And before the Calder household?" A beat. "I was young," she said. "I don't remember all of it clearly." His gaze moved over her. Not in the way men sometimes looked at servant girls in ways that made her want to put a door between herself and them. Nothing like that. More like an inventory, careful and impersonal. His eyes traveled to her neck, where the old scarf was wrapped above the collar of her service dress. Something changed in his expression. It was minor, a small tightening around the eyes, the slight recalibration of focus that happened when a person's attention, which had been broadly distributed, suddenly narrowed to a point. Mirelle was aware of it happening and didn't understand it. "That scarf," he said. "Where did you get it?" The question landed strangely, not threateningly. Nothing in his tone had sharpened, but with a precision that suggested the question mattered in a way she couldn't yet identify. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "Sir?" "Your mother." He seemed to sit with that for a moment, then, "What was her name?" "Marin?" Mirelle said. "Mirelle Rowan." Something moved across his face, there and gone, contained immediately by whatever discipline he operated under. He looked at her for another second, the way someone looked at a map when a landmark had appeared in an unexpected location. Then he pulled his gaze away. "Thank you," he said, and left the kitchen. Mirelle stayed kneeling at the hearthstone for a moment after his footsteps faded down the corridor. The cloth had stopped moving without her noticing. She started it again. She scrubbed the stone. She didn't think about the question or the way he had asked it or the pause afterward because she had learned not to pull at threads she didn't have the standing to follow. But she felt it. The way you felt a change in air pressure, before you had the words for what it meant. 3 days passed. They were not calm days exactly, but they were the kind that looked calm on the surface because everyone was performing calm with the specific intensity of people who had something to hide. The Crown Marshal's presence in the manor had a quality to it, not intrusive, not openly confrontational, but persistent in the way of a cold draft that you kept blocking and kept finding new ways in. He ate at the formal table by Celine's invitation, which she had apparently extended with the graciousness of someone who had no choice. He spoke pleasantly. He asked questions that were phrased as conversation. And somewhere in the manor's back hallways and record rooms, his presence was doing something else entirely. Mirelle didn't know the specifics, but she could feel it in the quality of the house's tension, The way Lena moved through her duties with her eyes slightly too far forward, focused on a point nobody else could see. Selene had a visitor's dinner on the second evening. Mirelle was assigned to clean the upstairs rooms while the dinner was in progress. Again, the invisible deployment. She worked through the guest chambers and the sitting room, moving quietly, changing out towels and checking the oil in the lamps. And she was in the upper hallway when she passed close enough to the study to hear voices through the partially open door. She recognized Selene's voice immediately. The second voice was male, older, familiar from previous banquets. Lord Selene Vorath, whose family held the northern trade routes and whose relationship with Selene Vorath went back further than Mirelle's 3 years in the household. Taken long enough, Selene was saying, her voice controlled but carrying an edge that Mirelle recognized as the register she used when her patience was a performance she was giving out of necessity rather than choice. "You said the records were secure." "They were secure," Vorath said. "They are secure. What he's looking for, Selene, you can't read a document that doesn't exist. He already found the census ledger, the old one." A pause. "The old one doesn't have... It has names, Essen. Names that connect to other names. He's not looking for a document. He's pulling a thread." Her voice dropped, something hardening underneath it. "He found the Rowan girl." Silence on the other side of the door. A different quality of silence than had come before. "Found her how?" Vorath said. "I don't know. He talked to her in the kitchen. He asked her about her mother." A pause. "He was looking at the scarf." Another silence. "That scarf should have been taken from her years ago," Vorath said quietly. "I didn't know what it was years ago." Selene's voice had taken on a flatness that was in its way more alarming than anger would have been. "I know now. I want it dealt with." "Be careful," Vorath said. "If Vale is looking at her and something happens to her..." "Nothing will happen to her. I want her gone, Essen. I want her out of this house and out of this province, and I want a reason that doesn't invite questions." A pause. "She's a servant. Servants leave. Servants get dismissed for cause." Another pause. And Mirelle could hear the shape of a decision being made on the other side of the door, the kind that had a specific weight to it. "I'll find cause." Mirelle was already moving down the corridor, her footsteps silent, her face doing the thing it had learned to do, assembling itself into a perfect blankness, a surface that gave nothing back. She didn't know what she had heard. She knew it was dangerous. She had been dangerous to Selene Vorath before she understood why. That was the thing that sat in her chest that night, on her pallet in the east corridor with the cold pressing through the stone and her hand wrapped in the old scarf, its faded border under her fingers. Dangerous for a reason she couldn't name, for a reason that lived in her mother's name and a piece of embroidered cloth and a melody she had never been able to explain. She lay in the dark and let herself hear it. The lullaby. Not aloud, just the shape of it, moving through her mind the way water moved through familiar channels, finding the low places. Her mother had sung it to her. Her mother, who had died when she was too young to understand dying, in a place she couldn't quite picture, with a face she could feel the presence of without being able to see it clearly. The melody had no words she could remember, just the tune, low and specific, and unlike any folk song she'd ever heard in the households she'd moved through. She'd tried once, early on, to ask Hesse if she recognized it, humming a fragment of it, and Hesse had gone very still in a way that she still didn't fully understand, and said quietly, "That's not something you should hum in a house like this," and moved on to another topic and never referenced it again. Mirelle had stopped humming it in front of people. She lay on the pallet and listened to the cold settle into the stone and thought about the Crown Marshal's face when she told him her mother's name, the way something had moved through his expression and then disappeared, carefully contained. She thought about his question, "Where did you get it?" and the precision of it, the way he'd looked at the scarf like someone who recognized something he hadn't expected to find. She didn't let herself follow it further than that. Following it meant something she didn't have the architecture to accommodate, some rearrangement of everything she understood about her own story, and she had survived 3 years in this house and 6 before it by not allowing herself rearrangements she couldn't control. Sleep came slowly. It came in the way it always did, Not as rest exactly, but as the suspension of consciousness by a body that had used everything it had for the day and needed to reset. She'd long since stopped expecting it to feel like anything more than that. The cause arrived on the fourth morning. She was in the storehouse, taking inventory of the winter linens, a task Lena had given her before dawn, which was early even by the household's compressed standards, and which Mirelle had moved through efficiently enough that she was nearly done. The storehouse was a separate outbuilding behind the manor's east wing, accessible through a narrow passage between the main building and the wall. Cold in the way outbuildings in the northern estates were cold, a dedicated, settled cold, not the draft and gap cold of the manor's interior, but the real thing, the kind that came up through stone floors and breathed out of the wooden shelving and existed independently of whatever the weather was doing outside. She was on the upper shelf reaching for a bolt of formal table linen when she heard the door open behind her. She came down from the step stool and found two of the estate's indoor staff standing in the doorway. Not Lena, not Hessa, not anyone she thought of as connected to the ordinary running of the house. These were the two men Selene had brought from the capital when she'd taken permanent residence in the manor 3 years ago. They hadn't come from the Duke's household. They had come from Selene's personal staff, and they reported to her in ways that bypassed the usual house hierarchy, and Mirelle had learned in the first week to treat them the same way you treated a lock on a door, as a mechanism you understood was there to keep you in or out, but were not invited to engage with unless necessary. "Lady Selene wants to see you," the taller one said. It was not a request framed as a request. She followed them across the courtyard and through the manor's east entrance and up to Selene's private receiving room on the first floor. Not the formal parlor, not the drawing room, but the smaller room Selene used for the business of the household she preferred not to conduct in front of guests. It had a window that looked out over the north drive and a desk and 2 chairs, and it always smelled of the specific perfume Selene wore, something complex and cool that sat in the air long after she'd left a room. Selene was standing at the window when Mirelle entered. She was wearing a deep burgundy morning dress with her dark hair already pinned, which meant she'd been awake for some time. She didn't turn immediately. She stood with her hands behind her back, looking out at the drive, and the quality of her stillness was the specific kind that happened when someone had already decided on something and was simply conducting the final internal preparations before executing it. The two men positioned themselves near the door, not blocking it, not yet, just present. Mirelle stood in the center of the room and waited. Selene turned. "I had the storehouse checked last night," she said. "The inventory from 3 months ago against the current count." Mirelle kept her face neutral. She felt the structure of it immediately. The setup, the intended conclusion, the geometry of it already laid. "I only received the inventory assignment this morning," she said. "The silver candlesticks from the east storage." Selene's voice was flat and clean, the voice of someone who had built the case entirely before presenting it. 6 of them, part of the formal dinner service. They're not in the count." "I can check the current count against the record," Mirelle said. "If there's a discrepancy, there's a discrepancy." Selene looked at her with that particular expression. Not anger, not triumph, something colder than either. "I've had 3 years to watch you, girl. The way you move through this house, the way you listen, the way you store things, assess things, as though you're preparing for something." A pause. "It stops today." "I haven't taken anything," Mirelle said. Her voice stayed level. That's exactly what someone who had taken something would say. It's also what someone who hadn't would say. Something moved in Selene's expression. A quick, sharp reorganization, the slight adjustment of someone who had expected less. But it lasted only a moment. "The Crown Marshal is conducting an investigation into the northern households," Selene said, shifting tack with the ease of someone who'd prepared multiple approaches. "A theft accusation during a Crown visit would be unfortunate for everyone. It becomes part of his documentation. It raises questions about the household standards." She paused, letting the shape of the offer configure itself in the air between them. "Leave tonight. Take nothing from this house. Don't present yourself to any household within this province. I'll have you escorted to the road." Mirelle looked at her. She thought about the conversation she'd heard through the study door. "I want her gone, Essen." She thought about Adrian Vale's face in the kitchen, the way his gaze had landed on the scarf and then sharpened into something specific. She thought about Hesse saying that's not something you should hum, and the fear in it, not fear of what Mirelle was doing, but fear of what someone else might do if they heard it. She was 18 years old. She had nothing. No family she could name, no property beyond the clothes on her back and the scarf at her throat, no documentation of her history that she'd ever been allowed to hold in her own hands. She was a servant in a house that wanted her gone for reasons she didn't fully understand yet. The rational thing, the survivable thing, was to leave quietly, to walk out to the road, to find another posting somewhere in a province where no one knew her and nothing that was happening here could reach her. She thought about all of this in the time it took her to breathe in and then out. "No," she said. Selene blinked, just once, a reflex. "No?" The word came out with a careful quality, as though Selene was testing whether she'd heard it correctly. "I won't leave for a theft I didn't commit." Mirelle kept her voice even. The steadiness of it surprised even her. Not the false steadiness of suppressed fear, but something quieter and more foundational, as though she had touched the bottom of something inside herself and found it solid. "If the Crown Marshal is conducting an investigation, then the Crown Marshal is the correct person to report a theft to, not the household." She paused. "Unless the goal isn't actually to recover the candlesticks." A very long silence. Selene looked at her. Not the way she usually looked at her, not the catalog of a woman assessing something inconvenient and disposable. Something different. Something that might, in another face, have been respect, but in Selene's face resolved into something harder and more specific. The recalibration of a predator that had misjudged its quarry. "Lachlan," Selene said. The taller man moved from the door. "Lady Selene." Mirelle held the eye contact. "A warrant for arrest requires documentation. If it's filed, the Crown Marshal will see it." "The Crown Marshal," Selene said quietly, "is not your protector." "No," Mirelle agreed. "He's not." She held still. "But he's interested in the records of this household, and a warrant for a servant accused of theft the day after he arrives with a crown seal is an interesting document to appear in those records." The room was very quiet. Through the window, the north drive was empty and pale in the morning light. In the distance, the mountains that formed Valedorn's northern boundary were white at their peaks, the snow having crept further down their slopes in the last week, winter advancing without consultation. Selene took exactly 3 seconds to make the calculation. "Get her out of my sight," she said. The men moved her toward the door, not violently, not in a way that would leave marks, but with the kind of handling that communicated clearly that there was no version of this where her preference was the relevant factor. She let herself be moved. The corridor outside the receiving room was cold, and she could hear, from somewhere in the back of the manor, the distant ordinary sounds of a household doing its morning work. They took her to the east wing, not to her quarters, to the storage room 3 doors down from her quarters, windowless, lockable from the outside, cold enough that the breath misted. The door closed. The bolt engaged. She stood in the dark for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, and thought. She thought about the lullaby, about the scarf's embroidered border, which she had looked at so many times she no longer really saw it. The pattern worn to near invisibility in most places, but intact at the corner, where the fabric had been protected by the fold. She had never been able to identify the pattern exactly. An interlocking design, repeating, precise, not the kind of folk embroidery she'd seen on the garments of ordinary women in the northern provinces. The kind of work that required skill and time and something better than ordinary thread. She thought about what Selene had said, the way she'd looked at the scarf like it was the actual problem. Not Mirelle, not the theft accusation. The scarf. She closed her eyes. In the dark behind them, she let herself hear the lullaby again, the shape of the melody, its particular character, the way it moved through registers that felt somehow formal, structured, unlike any lullaby she'd heard anyone else sing in the years of her service. She had never wondered about it, not properly. She had kept it as a fragment of her mother and not pulled at what it was beyond that. But she pulled at it now. In the cold and the dark, she pulled at it, and she felt not a solution, not an answer, but the sense of something vast and structured existing just beyond the edge of her comprehension. The feeling of standing at a door and understanding for the first time that it was a door and not simply a wall. The door was locked from the outside, but somewhere on the other side of this manor's walls, a man with a crown seal was looking for records that someone very powerful didn't want him to find. And he had asked about her scarf. Mirelle sat in the dark and waited, her hand wrapped around the frayed edge of the cloth, the embroidered corner between her fingers. The cold settled around her, and she breathed through it, and she held on to the only thing she'd ever owned that no one had assigned her. She did not know who she was, but she was starting to understand that someone else did, and had been afraid of it for a very long time. In the servant quarters, 2 corridors away, the morning continued its ordinary business. No one came looking for her. The manor ran its operations without her, as manors always did, because the architecture of power had always been built to continue without the people it was built on. But in the east wing of a large stone house in the cold northern kingdom of Valedorn, the records that could answer everything were moving closer to the hands of a man who had already noticed the wrong scarf on the wrong girl. And in Selene Vorath's receiving room, a woman who had spent years managing a secret was discovering that some things could not be managed, only delayed. The delay was almost over. Outside, the first snow of the year began to fall. It came quietly, the way the most significant things came, without announcement, without drama, settling into the stones of the North Drive and the bare limbs of the trees along the east wall and the mountains at Valedorn's border, covering everything that had been visible before. The bolt on the storage room door was solid iron. It would require a key or a man with specific authorization, and Mirelle had neither. But through the gap at the bottom of the door, she could see the snowlight changing the quality of the illumination in the corridor, brighter, more even, the specific white that came off fresh snow and found its way through every crack and imperfection in a stone building. She thought about a thing her mother had said once, one of the fragments she kept, examined rarely, held carefully. The memory was more sensation than words, the way the early memories always were, the smell of cold air and something else, something that was the smell of a specific place, and the feeling of being small and held, and the low sound of the lullaby, and beneath the lullaby, barely audible, a voice that said, "Remember the song. Even when they tell you to forget it, remember the song." She hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. The snow continued to fall on the kingdom of Valedorn. The 5th carriage, with its silver eagle insignia, sat in the North Drive courtyard, patient as a fact waiting to be acknowledged. Somewhere in the manor's record rooms, a man was pulling threads. And in the East Wing storage room, the girl everyone had spent 18 years teaching to be invisible sat in the dark and felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely, terrifyingly seen. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Footsteps. Deliberate. Not the quick step of the household staff, not the authority-performing stride of Selene's personal men. The footsteps of someone moving carefully through a space, taking note of it. They stopped outside her door. A pause. The specific pause of someone reading a situation, assembling a picture from incomplete parts. Then the sound of something sliding against iron. Not a key. Something else. The slow, methodical sound of a mechanism being engaged from the outside, working deliberately. The sound of someone who knew the difference between a lock and an obstacle and had stopped treating them as the same thing some time ago. The bolt disengaged. The door opened. In the frame of it, backlit by the snow-white corridor light, stood Crown Marshal Adrian Vale. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. In his hand was a document, old, the paper yellowed at the edges, the seal at its bottom, dark with age. His expression was carrying something she had never seen in the 4 days he'd been in this house. Not the controlled, impersonal attention she'd cataloged in the kitchen, but something underneath it, something that had come through the surface. "Mirelle Rowan," he said. The way he said her name was wrong. Not wrong like an error. Wrong like the way a word sounds wrong when you finally hear its full pronunciation after years of only reading it. More weight than you'd prepared for. More shape than the familiar fragment had suggested. "I need you to come with me," he said. "Right now." before Selene Vorath is informed that I've found what I came here looking for." She stood up. Her legs were steady. She didn't ask him yet what he'd found. She would ask him very soon, and the answer was going to take everything she thought she knew about her own life and arrange it into a shape she hadn't built and hadn't chosen and couldn't yet fully see. But she looked at him, at the old document in his hand, at the crown seal she could make out at its bottom, even from across the room, and she felt the bottom drop out of the present moment the way a floor drops out of a burning building. The girl who had been invisible for 18 years picked up her scarf from the corner of the floor where it had fallen when she sat down. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She walked through the door. The corridor was cold and white with snow light, and Adrian Vale was already moving before she'd finished wrapping the scarf. "Stay close," he said. "Don't speak until I tell you to." Mirelle followed him. She didn't ask where they were going. The document was still in his hand. She could see it in her peripheral vision, the yellowed paper, the dark seal. And the fact that he was moving with this specific controlled urgency told her that whatever he'd found had a time limit attached to it. That Selene either didn't know yet or was about to. They moved through the east wing toward the back staircase. Vale took it without hesitating, which meant he'd already mapped the house. Not casually, not in the way a guest learned a house over several days, but the way someone learned it when they'd come specifically to move through it unobserved. Mirelle noticed this and filed it and kept moving. They came out on the main floor through the service entrance, and he steered them toward the study. Not Selene's receiving room, not the formal parlor, but the estate's administrative study, which belonged technically to the Duke's household manager, and which Selene had repurposed as her own records room in the years since she'd taken effective control of the manor. He opened the door, closed it behind them. The study was dim, one lamp burning on the desk, the window giving the flat gray light of a snowing morning. The desk was covered in ledgers and documents, several of them open, and Mirelle could see that they hadn't been arranged by Selene's steward. They'd been arranged by someone going through them with a specific question in mind. Vale set the document on the desk and looked at her. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "I need you to answer it exactly. Not what you think I want to hear. Exactly what you know." "All right," Mirelle said. "Your mother, Mirelle Rowan. Where did she die?" Mirelle held the question for a moment. "I don't know the name of the place. I was young. I remember stone, a courtyard, I think, somewhere cold." She paused. "She died the same night she brought me somewhere. To a woman, I think. I don't have a clear memory of the woman's face." Vale was very still. "How old were you?" "I don't know exactly. Young enough that most of it is impressions rather than images. The lullaby she sang you." He said it carefully, the way you said something you'd been building toward for a long time and were finally allowing to land. "Have you ever heard it anywhere else? In any other household? From any other person?" The answer was immediate. No. He turned to the desk and picked up the old document. He held it out to her. She took it. The paper was stiff with age. The ink faded but legible in the lamp's light. It was a record of transfer. She understood that from the first few lines, the formal language of official documentation. A record of a child placed into the care of a family in the Eastern Marches. The date on it was from 18 years ago. The name of the child had been obscured, ink drawn carefully over it, an intentional redaction. But the notation at the bottom, in a different hand from the main text, was intact. It said, "Delivered safely. MR confirmed. The seal is with her." Below that, a second notation, this one in the cramped script of someone writing in haste. "The melody must not be repeated. If she remembers it, silence it. This is not protection. This is instruction." Mirelle read it twice. Her breathing had changed. Not audibly, not dramatically, but in the way breathing changed when the body was processing something that the mind hadn't fully caught up to yet. "MR," she said. "Mirelle Rowan," Vale said. "Your mother wasn't your mother by blood. She was a royal guard, one of 3 assigned to protect the youngest member of the royal family the night the palace was attacked." He paused. The other 2 guards didn't survive the night. The room was very quiet. Through the window, snow was falling on the north drive in slow, uncommitted flakes. "The royal family was attacked 18 years ago. Mirelle said. Her voice sounded to her like it belonged to someone standing slightly behind her. The king and queen were killed. The crown prince survived. He was old enough to be moved to the eastern garrison. The infant daughter was never confirmed dead. He looked at her steadily. Because she wasn't. Mirelle set the document back on the desk. She needed to put it down because her hands were doing something she didn't want them to do. A faint, involuntary tremor, the kind the body produced when it was taking on more than its current architecture had been built to handle. "You're saying I'm—" She stopped. "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with it. The birthmark on your shoulder, the scarf. That border pattern is a royal household embroidery. It was standard on the swaddling linens in the palace nursery. The melody you know is the Valedorn royal lullaby. It was never published, never distributed. The only people who knew it were members of the royal household." He paused. "And the record places a child matching your description, delivered by a woman named Mirelle Rowan in the Eastern Marches 18 years ago." "Consistent with," Mirelle said. "That's not the same as confirmed." "No," he said. "It's not." Something moved in his face. Not admiration exactly, but the recognition of something he respected. "Which is why I haven't done anything with it yet." She thought about Selene's face when Vale had first arrived. The particular fear in it. "I want her gone, Essen." She thought about the deliberate redaction on the document. Someone had removed the name carefully, intentionally, years ago. Not destroying the record, but obscuring it. The difference between those two things was significant. Destroying it erased the possibility. Obscuring it preserved something while hiding it. The act of someone who couldn't bring themselves to eliminate the evidence but needed it not to be found easily. Selene knew, Mirelle said. Her family was part of the network that concealed the disappearance, in exchange for influence at court after the attack. Vale's voice was flat, factual, carrying the specific quality of someone who had assembled an ugly picture and was presenting it without editorializing because the picture spoke well enough for itself. They weren't behind the attack, but they benefited from it, and they spent the following 18 years making certain the infant daughter was never located. Except I ended up in her house. She didn't know who you were when you came here, not at first. You came with false documentation from the Calder household, standard for displaced servants of your age. She found out approximately 14 months ago. He paused. That's when the documentation requests from her household to the provincial archive started. She was looking for the same records I found. Mirelle absorbed this. 14 months. For 14 months she had been living in this house, carrying her mother's scarf, not knowing that the woman who ordered her to stay invisible had been watching her with a kind of cold, calculating terror. She was waiting to see if anyone else knew, Mirelle said. Yes. And then you arrived. Yes. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same directness he'd had in the kitchen. Not the softness of pity, not the managed distance of someone delivering difficult information and waiting for an appropriate response. Just the direct, undecorated attention of someone who had decided she was worth the truth and was giving it to her without packaging it. What happens now? She asked. That depends on you. He said it without hesitation, which was itself a kind of answer. The implication that she had standing to determine the direction of this, that whatever came next was not something being done to her. The Queen Mother, Mirelle said. She's still alive. In the capital, yes. If the birthmark and the records and the melody, she stopped, found the steadier version of what she was trying to say. If everything is consistent with what you're suggesting, the Queen Mother would be the person to confirm it. Correct. And Selene would do everything in her power to prevent that confirmation from happening. Which is why, Vale said, we have a limited window before she realizes what's in this room. As if the house had been listening, Mirelle heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Not Selene's footsteps, the house steward's, Lena's quick, efficient stride, but moving in the direction of the east wing, moving in the direction of the storage room where she was supposed to be locked and contained and not a problem. Vale heard it too. His head turned fractionally toward the door. How long? Mirelle asked. 3 minutes before Lena checks the room. 5 before she reports to Selene. He was already moving, going to the desk, gathering the specific documents with the efficiency of someone who'd predetermined exactly which ones mattered. I have horses in the courtyard. My men are outside. She'll claim the documents are stolen, Mirelle said. She'll accuse you of... She can file whatever claims she likes. A Crown Marshal's warrant supersedes a state jurisdiction. He looked at her. But none of that matters if we're still in this building when she calls the estate guard. Mirelle picked up the old document from the desk, the one with MR confirmed and the notation about the melody. She folded it carefully and held it. I'm taking this, she said. He didn't object. He simply said, Let's go. Sam. They came out through the manor's east service exit into the courtyard, where the snow was coming down with more commitment now, the flakes thicker, the ground beginning to hold a white layer over the stone. Two of Vale's men were waiting with horses. Not the formal carriage, but riding horses, already saddled, breath misting in the cold. Mirelle had ridden before, not well, not confidently, but enough to stay mounted. She took the nearer horse without comment, settled herself, and pulled her scarf tighter across her shoulders. From somewhere in the manor behind them, she heard a door open. Then Selene's voice, carrying across the courtyard, with the particular carrying quality of a voice that had spent years learning to project authority across large spaces. Marshal Vale. Vale was already mounted. He looked back once. Not the look of someone who'd been caught, but the look of someone who'd been expecting this and had prepared for it. Selene came through the manor's main entrance with Lena 2 steps behind her and one of her personal men moving to flank her left. She had her coat on, which meant she'd known something was moving before she'd come outside. She'd prepared. She was walking with the specific controlled speed of someone managing the gap between what they were feeling and what they were allowing to show, and not entirely succeeding. Her eyes went to Mirelle first, then to Vale, then to the documents in Vale's satchel. Whatever she's told you, Selene said, her voice level, this girl is a thief and an accused criminal in my household. I have documentation. You have a warrant you drafted last evening, Vale said, for a theft that hasn't been formally investigated, and for which there is currently no witness statement, no inventory confirmation, and no recovered property. He looked at her with the flat, unimpressed patience of someone who'd heard this particular category of argument before. I'm aware of what you have, Lady Vorath. I'm also aware of what I have. Those are 2 different conversations. Selene's jaw tightened. This is my estate. Those records were generated under Crown authority during the reorganization of the northern provinces 18 years ago. They fall under Crown jurisdiction. He paused. You're welcome to petition the capital for their return. I'd advise against it. The space between his last word and Selene's response was 5 full seconds. Mirelle counted them without meaning to. Selene was doing the same calculation Mirelle had watched her do in the receiving room, running the variables, assessing angles, the specific internal motion of a person who had survived as long as she had by knowing when to press and when to wait. She was looking at Mirelle when she made her decision, not at Vale. You don't know what you're carrying, Selene said. It was addressed to Mirelle directly. The first time she'd spoken to her as though she was a person capable of receiving a meaningful statement rather than a piece of furniture requiring repositioning. Whatever he's told you, whatever story he's assembled from those records, you should understand that the people who want that story told are not the people who will protect you once it's out in the world. Mirelle held her gaze. I've been in your house for 3 years, she said. I think I have a reasonable sense of what your protection looks like. Something moved across Selene's face, the ghost of something that in another life, under entirely different circumstances, might have been acknowledgement. It lasted a moment. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was harder and more familiar. Ride carefully, Marshal, Selene said. The northern roads are treacherous in the first snow. It wasn't a pleasantry. Vale turned his horse toward the north drive. Mirelle followed. She didn't look back at the manor, not because she was preventing herself from doing so, but because she found that she genuinely had no impulse to. 3 years of that house were behind her, and the body had a way of releasing things the moment they were actually over, the tension dropping out of the shoulders and the breathing changing register, the low, constant vigilance that had been running like a secondary system inside her, simply shutting off. What replaced it wasn't relief. Relief implied that what was coming was safer than what had been left. She was not naive enough to believe that. What replaced it was something more elemental and less comfortable. The feeling of standing on open ground with no walls on any side, exposed in every direction, yes, but also finally able to see the full distance of the horizon. The manor gate closed behind them. The north drive opened onto the main road, already softened with new snow, the mountains in the distance white and immovable against a gray sky. She held the folded document under her scarf, against her chest, where the cold couldn't reach it. They rode for 2 hours before Vale called the stop at a way station, a stone outbuilding maintained by the Crown for exactly this kind of transit, stocked with firewood and provisions, and a means of sending messages ahead to the next post. His 2 men took the horses while Vale unlocked the station and Mirelle came inside, unwrapping the scarf, the warmth of the small space hitting her after the cold of the road, with the specific physical relief of something the body had been wanting and hadn't been allowed to want, while it was managing more immediate problems. Vale built the fire. He didn't ask her if she wanted it built or suggest she do it. He simply built it, the economical actions of someone who'd spent time in field conditions and treated fire as a logistical matter. She sat on the bench against the far wall and watched him. "You're going to take me to the Queen Mother," she said. "That's the intent." He didn't look up from the fire. "There's a grand assembly in 3 months. The Winter Crown Ball. Every major noble house in Valedorn attends. The Queen Mother will be there." He paused. "If the confirmation happens there, publicly, with witnesses, it can't be quietly buried afterward. And until then, you travel with my detail, under Crown protection." He looked at her. "That's not a comfortable existence. We move frequently. You'll be carrying a secret that certain people will want to keep secret and will be willing to act on that preference." "I've been carrying something those people wanted hidden for 18 years, Mirelle said. "Without knowing it, without protection, without any of the resources you're describing." She held his gaze. "I think I can manage 3 months. He looked at her for a moment in the firelight, that same direct assessment she'd catalogued in the kitchen, but with something additional in it now, something that had come through his careful professional surface the way cold came through stone. Not softness exactly, more like the recognition between 2 people who had each learned to do difficult things without the support structures that made difficult things easier, and had identified the same quality in each other. "The birthmark," he said. "I'll need to document it, for the formal record." "I know." "And the melody. I'll need you to sing it, or hum it, for a musician in the capital who served in the royal household. She can confirm it independently of the written record." Mirelle thought about Hesse. That's not something you should hum in a house like this. Hesse had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to be afraid of what it meant if the wrong person heard it. "There are people in the north who know the melody," she said, "who recognized it and said nothing." "I know," Vale said. "We'll need to understand who they were protecting." "Maybe they were protecting me," she said. He held the thought for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the specific gravity of someone accepting a correction that mattered. Outside the way station, the snow continued to fall on the northern road. The fire had taken hold and was beginning to push the cold back from the center of the small room. Somewhere between the manor they'd left and the capital they were heading toward, 18 years of deliberate concealment was coming apart at the seams, and the people who had built that concealment were already moving. Mirelle unfolded the document one more time and read the notation at the bottom. "Delivered safely. MR confirmed. The seal is with her." The seal. She touched the embroidered corner of the scarf, the one place where the pattern was still intact, still visible, the interlocking design her fingers had traced so many times that she felt it more than saw it. She had always thought it was simply decoration. She looked at it now in the firelight, really looked at it, and the pattern resolved into something she recognized. Not from memory, not from anything she could name, but from the deep and wordless part of her that had always known the melody was not ordinary, and the scarf was not ordinary, and the strange, persistent sense of displacement she'd carried through every household she'd ever served in was not simply the ordinary loneliness of a girl with no family. The interlocking design was a crest. She had been carrying the royal seal of Valedorn against her skin for 18 years. The fire crackled. Vale was at the station's small writing desk, drafting the first of what she understood would be many official documents. Outside, his men moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had learned to work in the field without discussion. The road behind them led back to Selene Vorath and the accelerating machinery of everything she would now do to prevent what was coming. The road ahead led to a capital that didn't know she existed. And somewhere in the distance, the Winter Crown Ball was 3 months away. A fixed point in time, visible and absolute, the place where 18 years of buried truth would either surface completely or be pushed under for good. Mirelle folded the document, wrapped the scarf back around her shoulders, felt the embroidered crest against her collarbone, the specific pressure of it, the weight of it, which was exactly the same as it had always been and entirely different. She had survived 18 years not knowing who she was. She was going to have to learn, very quickly, how to survive knowing. The door to the way station opened. One of Vale's men stepped in, snow on his shoulders, his expression carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering information they'd rather not be delivering. "Marshal," he said. "Riders on the South Road. 4 of them, moving fast. Vorath colors." Vale looked up from the desk. His face did not change. "How long?" he said. 20 minutes, maybe less." Vale looked at Mirelle. She was already standing. "The horses," she said. "The horses," he confirmed. They left the fire burning. They rode hard for 40 minutes before Vale called the turn. Not back toward the capital. East, off the main road, onto a track that was barely a track, more the memory of one, threading between bare-limbed trees with snow collecting in their upper branches and dropping in small cold masses when the wind moved through them. Mirelle kept her horse close behind Vale's, her eyes on the road ahead, not on the sound of hooves she could no longer hear from the south, but knew were still coming. Vorath's riders knew this country better than Vale's men did. That was the arithmetic of the situation, and she'd done it without being asked and hadn't liked the answer. Vale knew it too. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. Not fear, nothing as simple as that, but the specific muscular quality of a man running calculations while his body did something else and not finding a result that satisfied him. They came out of the tree track onto a secondary road heading northeast, toward the village of Unravel. Small, provincial, the kind of settlement that appeared on Crown maps as a notation rather than a destination. Vale pulled up at the village's edge, where a stone-walled inn sat back from the road with smoke coming from 2 chimneys and a stable yard visible behind it. "We stop here," he said. 2 hours. I need to send word ahead to the capital. Vorath's riders won't follow us into a populated area. Not today." He looked at her. "She's operating on intimidation, not authorization. She doesn't have a warrant. Anything her men do on a public road with Crown witnesses present becomes documentation she can't manage." Mirelle absorbed this. The logic was sound. It also depended on Selene making rational decisions, and Selene frightened was not always Selene rational, but she understood the principle, and she understood that Vale was not a man who made tactical errors carelessly. They dismounted in the stable yard. His 2 men took the horses. Vale went inside without ceremony, identifying himself to the innkeeper with the crown seal and the specific quiet authority of someone who'd done this before in enough similar situations that the routine had worn smooth. A room was made available. A meal was arranged. A message courier was summoned from the village's small crown post. Mirelle sat at the table in the back room Vale had secured and ate without tasting what she was eating and thought about the document folded against her chest and the crest embroidered on her scarf, and the fact that somewhere between those 2 things was a version of her life she had not been permitted to know existed. Vale came back to the table after 20 minutes, the courier gone, and sat across from her. He had a map, which he spread between them, and for a time they talked logistics, routes, timelines, the location of Crown-sanctioned safe houses between the northern province and the capital. His voice was measured, his pace efficient. He was good at this. She could see in him the long training of a man who had learned to keep the operational and the personal in separate compartments, who could discuss the mechanics of a dangerous situation without bleeding the weight of it into every sentence. She was learning to do that herself. She wasn't sure yet if it was a skill she wanted. "The Queen Mother's household," Mirelle said, when the logistics had been laid out. "Does she know to expect us?" "Not yet. The message I sent will reach my contact in the capital in 3 days. He'll communicate with the Queen Mother's chamberlain through channels Selene's network won't have visibility into." He paused. "It's the network I trust. How many people know where we are right now?" He looked at her. "My 2 men. The innkeeper, who knows only that a crown marshal and a traveling companion required a back room for 2 hours. The courier, who knows only the contents of a sealed dispatch." He paused. "And whoever those contents reach." She held that. The natural endpoint of the question was a thing she didn't voice, that every network had a point of weakness, and the longer they moved through it, the more points accumulated. Vale knew this. She could see it in the way he'd answered, the slight pause before the last sentence, the acknowledgement of the variable he couldn't fully close. She trusted him. She'd decided that somewhere on the road between the manor and the way station, some interior calculation she hadn't been fully conscious of running had produced that conclusion. It wasn't naive trust. It wasn't the trust of someone who hadn't been taught by experience to be careful with it. It was the trust of someone who had read a person closely over several days and found that what was on the surface was consistent with what was underneath. In her experience, that kind of consistency was rare enough to matter. What she didn't yet know was whether his trust in his own network was as well-founded as his instincts about her. They reached the capital's outer district on the 9th day. The road had been hard. 4 route changes, 2 nights in conditions that didn't qualify as shelter in any generous sense of the word. 1 close encounter on the 3rd day with a group of riders whose insignia Vale had identified as belonging to a northern noble family with documented ties to the Vorath network. They'd gone around. Vale's men had handled it without incident, with the controlled efficiency that came from operating in exactly this kind of environment. Mirelle had handled it without incident too, which Vale had noted with the minimal acknowledgement of someone who didn't waste words on things that had simply gone as expected. She had been thinking, through the 9 days, about the Queen Mother. Not with fear exactly, with the particular internal preparation of someone who understood that a meeting could go in multiple directions and had no control over which one it chose. The Queen Mother was old. She had been old when the royal family was attacked, old enough that 18 years more had carried her well past the point where age was a thing she was approaching, and into the territory where it was simply a fact of her person. She had survived the attack that had killed her son and daughter-in-law. She had survived 18 years of a kingdom held in regency, managed by council, the crown in suspension pending the resolution of an inheritance no one had managed to resolve. She was, by every account Mirelle had collected in fragments over the years, a woman of considerable will. What Mirelle didn't know was how that will would respond to the return of something it had perhaps stopped believing would return. The safe house in the capital's eastern quarter was a narrow building on a lane that smelled of old stone and wood smoke, maintained by a crown archivist named Petra, who wore her gray hair in a knot at her neck, and received them with the brisk welcome of someone who had been expecting them and had opinions about the timing. 3 days late, Petra said, taking their coats. 4 route changes, Vale said. I heard about the Vorath riders. Sit down, both of you. She looked at Mirelle with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who dealt in information and had been briefed on what she was looking at. Not unkind, just thorough. I have news from the palace. Some of it is what you want, some of it isn't. Start with what isn't, Vale said. Petra poured 2 cups of something hot and set them on the table and sat across from them and folded her hands with the specific composure of someone delivering a difficult situation and choosing not to soften it. Lord Morath arrived in the capital 6 days ago, she said. He's been meeting with 3 members of the Noble Assembly, the ones with the most leverage over the Winter Crown Ball's scheduling and guest arrangements. Vale was very still. He moved fast. He had a 6-day head start. Petra paused. The meetings are private. My contact inside the assembly can confirm the fact of them, but not the content. She looked at Mirelle. But the timing and the participants, given what you're carrying, the inference isn't difficult. He's trying to control the environment before we get there, Mirelle said. Yes. Petra looked at Vale. There's something else. The quality of Petra's stillness changed, a subtle shift, the kind that happened when someone was about to say something they'd been sitting with long enough that the discomfort had settled into their posture. Your dispatch, she said. The one you sent from the north. I received it. I communicated with the Queen Mother's Chamberlain as instructed. A pause. But there was a third person who knew the contents of that message. Someone in the relay chain. Vale's jaw tightened, barely visible. Who? Kale, Petra said. The name landed in the room, and Vale went very still in the way that stillness happened when the body received something the mind hadn't fully processed yet. The suspension before the response. The moment between the blow and the pain. Kale. The name meant nothing to Mirelle, but she watched Vale's face and understood from it that it meant a great deal to him, and that the meaning was the specific kind that came from a long history and not simply a professional connection. You're certain, Vale said. His voice was level, completely level, which was its own kind of information. My contact pulled the relay records. Petra set a piece of paper on the table between them. The message passed through 4 hands. The third hand was Kyle. By the time I received it, the contents had been copied. She paused. Moraith has them. Silence. Mirelle looked at the paper on the table and then at Vale. He was looking at the paper too, but she understood from his face that he wasn't seeing it. He was somewhere else, in the specific interior landscape of a person who had just watched a structure they had built and relied on collapse from a point they hadn't thought to reinforce, because they had trusted it completely. She understood this feeling. She had lived in a house with Selene Vorath for 3 years. Kale was your man, she said. Not a question. Vale said nothing for a moment, then, for 11 years. 11 years. She did not say anything about the 11 years because there was nothing to say about them that Vale didn't already know, and that wouldn't be a diminishment of something that had its own weight and didn't need her adding to it. She waited. Moraith has the contents of the dispatch, Vale said. He was pulling himself back to the operational surface. She could see it happening, the deliberate refocus, the way he set the personal thing down and picked up the problem instead. He knows we're in the capital. He knows we intend to approach the Queen Mother. He knows the evidence we're carrying. He knows what's in the documents, Petra said. He doesn't know where the documents physically are. He'll assume they're with us. Yes. He'll also assume we'll move toward the Queen Mother's household directly. He'd be correct, Petra said, if we didn't know he knew. A pause. Mirelle watched Vale process the architecture of it, the way a situation changed when the element of surprise was gone, when the other side had the same information and was already positioned to use it. The advantage they'd had was the distance between what they knew and what Moraith knew. That distance was now 0. The Winter Crown Ball, Mirelle said. Both of them looked at her. Moraith can control a private approach to the Queen Mother. He can intercept communication. He can manage who gets access and when. She kept her voice steady. He can't control a public moment, not in front of the entire assembled court. The ball is 6 weeks away, Vale said. Then we wait 6 weeks. But 6 weeks gives Moraith time to build a counter-narrative, to present his version of the evidence to the assembly before we present ours. Vale's voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone working the problem rather than reacting to it. If he gets to the Queen Mother first with his framing, then we get to her before he does, Mirelle said. Not through official channels, not through the Chamberlain, directly. Petra was watching her with the particular quality of attention that came from someone reassessing an initial assessment. Directly, Vale repeated. The Queen Mother's household runs a closed schedule. Private access requires, I know a melody that only one kind of person in this kingdom would know, Mirelle said. I know it in the exact form it was taught, not a transcription, not a reproduction, the original. She held Vale's gaze. If the Queen Mother hears it from me before Moraith poisons the water, she'll know. Whatever she's been told about what's possible and what isn't, she'll know before her mind can talk her out of it. A pause. You said the musician who could confirm the melody is in the capital.
She's in the palace, Petra said quietly. She's served the Queen Mother's household for 30 years. Then she's the door, Mirelle said. Another silence. Outside the safe house, the capital moved through its ordinary day. Cartwheels on stone, voices in the lane, the distant bell of a clock tower marking the afternoon, the sounds of a city that didn't know what was sitting in a narrow building on its eastern edge, folded in a piece of cloth against a girl's chest. Vale looked at her for a long moment. She could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, the risk assessment, the variables, the weight of what had just happened with Kale set against the weight of what would happen if they lost the initiative entirely. If Moraith finds out we've made contact with the palace musician, he said, before the ball, before any official confirmation. He'll move, Mirelle said. Yes. The thing he's been trying to prevent for 18 years becomes imminent. He'll stop managing the situation. Vale paused. He'll try to eliminate it. The words sat in the air between them, exact and undecorated. Mirelle felt it land without flinching. She had been thinking about this, about the specific moment when the threat moved from career and status to something more immediate. Since the storage room in Selene's manor, since the moment she'd watched Vale's face absorb the news about Kale and understood that every layer of protection had a seam, and every seam had a person standing in it who could choose to step aside. She thought about her mother, Mirelle Rowan, a royal guard who had run through a burning palace with an infant and made it to the Eastern Marches and died getting her there. Not a dramatic death, not a story death, just a woman who had spent everything she had on a single night and not had anything left after it. She thought about being that infant, about the 18 years of invisibility that had followed, about Hessa's voice saying, "That's not something you should hum in a house like this," the fear in it, the care in it, the care of someone who had known something was dangerous and had positioned herself around it as best she could. The world was full of people who had been protecting her in the ways available to them. Most of those ways had been small and quiet and had cost the people doing them something real. She was done being a thing that needed protecting. "Then we move first," she said. "Tonight, before Moraith knows we're here." Vale held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Petra. "The musician's name," he said. Petra unfolded her hands and reached for the paper on the table and turned it over and wrote a name on the back and slid it across. Vale read it, nodded. He looked back at Mirelle. His expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it. Not soft, nothing as simple as that, but the specific openness of a person who had just watched someone else make a decision that changed the terms of a situation and had recognized in it something that commanded a response beyond professional assessment. "You understand what tonight means," he said. "If this works, there's no version of the next 6 weeks that isn't a fight." "I've been fighting since I was 15, Mirelle said. "I just didn't know what for." She stood. She picked up her scarf from the table and wrapped it around her shoulders, her fingers finding the embroidered crest at the corner out of long habit. She held it for a moment, the specific pressure of it, the pattern under her fingertips that she had touched 1,000 times without knowing what it was. She knew what it was now. Outside the safe house, the capital's evening was coming in fast, the winter dark arriving early the way it did in the north. Somewhere in the palace at the city's center, an old woman carried 18 years of grief for a granddaughter she had been told was probably dead. Somewhere in the same city, Lord Essen Moraith was meeting with men who had spent those 18 years building a world that depended on that grief being permanent. And in a narrow building on the eastern lane, a girl who had learned to be invisible was deciding, with the same finality as a door closing on everything that had come before it, that she was finished with invisibility. The fire in the safe house hearth crackled once and settled. Petra stood. "I'll get your coats," she said. The palace musician's name was Orla. She lived not in the palace proper, but in a row of attached residences on the palace's southern perimeter, maintained by the crown for senior household staff, who had served long enough that permanent proximity was simply the arrangement, not a reward, not a concession, just the practical acknowledgement that some people had woven themselves so completely into an institution's fabric that separating them from it would damage both. Her window was lit when they arrived, the warm yellow of an oil lamp visible through the gap in the curtains,
and Vale stood at the narrow door with Mirelle beside him and knocked twice with the specific interval that Petra had told him to use. A long pause. The curtain moved. Then the sound of a bolt drawn back and the door opened 6 inches, held by a chain, and an eye looked out at them. Dark, sharp, set in a face that belonged to a woman in her 60s who had the particular quality of someone who had survived a great deal by being very careful about which doors she opened and for whom. Vale said his name and his rank and showed the crown seal through the gap. The eye moved to Mirelle. "Who's she?" Orla said, not a question with any softness in it. "That," Vale said, "is why we're here." Another pause. Longer. Then the chain came off and the door opened and Orla stepped back into the small warm room and looked at Mirelle with the direct, sustained attention of someone who was doing more than looking, who was searching, specifically, for something she had a precise mental image of and was checking the woman in front of her against it. Mirelle stood still and let herself be looked at. Orla's eyes moved to the scarf, stopped. "Come in," she said. Her voice had changed registers. Still controlled, still careful, but carrying something underneath it now, a vibration that hadn't been there before. They came in. Vale closed the door. The room was small and warm, a fire in the grate, shelves of music parchment along one wall, an instrument in the corner that Mirelle didn't know the name of, its body a dark, polished wood that caught the firelight. Orla did not sit. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Mirelle and said, "Sing it." No preamble, no explanation of what it was, just the instruction, clean and absolute from a woman who had been waiting 18 years to either hear this or confirm it was gone forever. Mirelle looked at her. She thought about Hisa, about the fear in Hessa's voice, about every time she had pressed the melody down and kept it internal, a private thing, a thing she'd protected without knowing what she was protecting. She let it out. Not loud. The room was small, and the hour was late, and she didn't know yet what the outside of her voice sounded like carrying this particular melody. So she kept it low, kept it controlled, the tune moving through its specific intervals, its formal, unhurried structure, the melody her mother had sung her in a place she couldn't picture and a time she couldn't access except through sensation. She sang 8 bars. Orla made a sound. It was not a word, and it was not composed. It was the sound a person made when the architecture of something they had built to survive loss cracked at its foundation. She put one hand flat against the wall beside her. She stood like that for a moment, her eyes closed, her breathing visible. Then she opened her eyes. "The birthmark," she said. Her voice was steady now. Steadied deliberately, the way you steadied something that would otherwise fall. Mirelle pulled the fabric at her shoulder aside. Orla crossed the room and looked at it for 3 seconds. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She turned to Vale and said, "When?" 6 weeks, Vale said. "The Winter Crown Ball. We need the Queen Mother to hear it in that room, in front of that assembly. Morith will try to prevent it. Morith already knows we're here, or will by morning." Orla looked at the fire. She was running something. Mirelle could see it, the internal processing of a person who had lived carefully for a long time and was now being asked to stop. "The Queen Mother needs to know before the ball," Orla said. "She needs to be prepared. If this lands on her without preparation, in front of the full assembly with Morith in the room, the shock alone could—" "Can you get to her?" Vale asked. "Privately, without going through the Chamberlain." Orla said nothing for a moment. Then, "There's a morning walk. Every day without exception. The East Garden, before the household is fully active. She goes alone, or as alone as a woman of her position ever goes, 2 guards who've been with her since before the attack, and who I would trust completely." She paused. "Tomorrow morning?" Vale looked at Mirelle. Mirelle said, "Yes." The East Garden in the hour before full dawn was the cold of a place that had been cold all night and hadn't decided yet to begin warming. Stone paths between dormant beds, the geometric architecture of formal plantings reduced by winter to their structural bones, bare branches and brown stalks, and the shapes of things that would come back in spring if the season allowed it. Snow from 2 days prior still sitting in the low places, undisturbed, the white of it gone faintly blue in the pre-dawn light. Mirelle waited near the garden's eastern wall, in the shadow of a stone pillar, with Vale 8 feet to her left, and Orla standing in the open path where the Queen Mother would see her first. Familiar, expected, the anchor that made the scene navigable rather than alarming. She heard her before she saw her. Not the footsteps. Those were slow, deliberate. The careful movement of a woman who had learned to move carefully through a world that had given her significant reasons to be careful. What she heard first was the quality of the silence around the steps, the specific silence of 2 guards moving in practice proximity to a person they were responsible for, a silence that was itself a form of presence. Then she came around the path's bend. The Queen Mother of Valedorn was a small woman made large by something that had nothing to do with physical scale. She was in her late 70s, white-haired, her face carrying the specific topography of a life lived at the intersection of power and loss. Not soft, not hard, but carved into something that had moved past both of those categories into a territory that was simply true. She wore a heavy coat and moved with a walking staff, and her eyes, which were a gray so pale they were nearly colorless, swept the garden with the habitual assessment of someone who had survived by never quite stopping paying attention. They found Orla first. Registered recognition, mild surprise at the hour. Then they moved and found Mirelle. The Queen Mother stopped. Not the stop of someone startled, the stop of someone who had seen something their body recognized before their mind caught up. The full halt of a deep system responding to input the surface mind was still processing. Mirelle stepped out of the shadow of the pillar and stood in the path. The 2 guards moved. Vale moved simultaneously, not threateningly but positioning, his hand up, his seal visible, his voice low and even. Crown Marshal Adrian Vale, I apologize for the method. I need 30 seconds before your guards make a decision. The Queen Mother did not look at him. She was looking at Mirelle. Orla, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Your Grace, Orla said, I need you to listen. A pause that had the weight of 18 years compacted into it. 30 seconds, the Queen Mother said. Mirelle sang. She sang it the same way she'd sung it in Orla's room. Low, controlled, the melody moving through its formal intervals. 7 bars, 8. She kept her eyes on the Queen Mother's face and watched it do something she had no name for. Watched the controlled, armored surface of a woman who had built that armor over 2 decades of surviving something unsurvivable begin, at some foundational level, to give. The melody ended. No one spoke. One of the guards had his hand on his weapon and hadn't drawn it, held in place by some instinct he couldn't articulate. Vale hadn't moved. Orla was watching the Queen Mother with the focus of someone who had waited a long time for this specific moment, and was now in it and didn't want to disturb it. The Queen Mother took 1 step forward, then another. She stopped 18 inches from Mirelle and looked at her face, really looked, the way Orla had looked, searching for something specific. Her hand came up and touched the edge of the scarf, the embroidered corner, with the lightness of someone touching something they hadn't believed they would ever touch again. The seal, she said. Her voice was barely sound. Yes, Mirelle said. The Queen Mother closed her eyes. She stood there for a moment, an old woman in a cold garden in the hour before dawn, and whatever was moving through her in that moment belonged entirely to her, and Mirelle did not try to read it or name it. She simply stood still and let it be what it was. Then the Queen Mother opened her eyes and looked at Vale. How long have you known? 11 days, he said, since I found the records in the Vorath estate. Vorath. The name landed in her mouth, and she tasted it, and her expression did something brief and precise. Of course. She looked back at Mirelle. You've been living in the north, in her house. For 3 years, Mirelle said. I didn't know. No. A pause. She would have made certain of that. The Queen Mother straightened, a physical adjustment that was also a mental one, the movement of someone making a decision and allowing it to reorganize their posture. Lord Moraith is in the capital. We know, Vale said. He came to see me 2 days ago. He told me... She paused, and the pause had an edge to it, Something that was not grief and was not quite anger, but was the thing that lived between them when it had been running a long time. He told me the Crown Marshal's investigation had uncovered a girl in the north making fraudulent claims to royal bloodline, that you had been misled by forged documentation. She looked at Vale. He was very convincing. He usually is, Vale said. I told him I would wait for a formal report. A beat. He was unhappy with that answer. She looked at Mirelle again with the specific quality of someone who was simultaneously doing several things at once, reading, remembering, calculating, and underneath all of it, fighting to keep something contained that wanted very much to stop being contained. The ball is in 6 weeks. We intend to present the evidence formally, Vale said. The birthmark, the records, the melody confirmed by Orla, in front of the full assembly. Vorath will challenge every piece of it. He can challenge. Challenged evidence in front of witnesses is better than managed silence. Vale paused. If you stand up in that room, Your Grace, if you hear the melody in that room and respond to it, no amount of challenge will carry sufficient weight. The Queen Mother was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, the sky had moved from black to dark blue, the first suggestion of dawn beginning at the horizon. He will not wait for the ball, she said. Vale said nothing. Vorath has been managing this for 18 years. He has not survived this long by allowing situations to develop to their natural conclusion. She looked at Vale directly. He will move before then. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, Vale said. Good. She looked at Mirelle one more time. The expression on her face was the most complex thing Mirelle had ever seen on a human face, the coexistence of too many large things in a space that could barely hold them. Stay alive, she said. Whatever else happens, stay alive until the ball. She turned and walked back toward the palace with her 2 guards falling in beside her, the walking staff tapping a steady rhythm on the stone path. And she did not look back, and Mirelle understood from the quality of her not looking back that it was not coldness. It was the only way she could keep walking. Vorath moved on the 14th day. They had relocated twice since the garden meeting, once to a safe house in the capital's western district, once to an inn in the outer city that Petra had secured under a name unconnected to anyone in the network. Vale had been careful, more careful than careful, the specific heightened vigilance of a man who had had his network compromised once and had rebuilt his operational assumptions from the ground up. Kale had been his instrument of communication. Vale no longer used instruments he hadn't personally verified at every point in the chain. It wasn't enough. It was the 14th morning when Mirelle woke to the sound of movement in the inn's lower floor. Not the ordinary movement of a house beginning its day, but the specific pattern of multiple people moving in coordinated, deliberate silence. The sound of a sweep, and she was out of bed and dressed before she was fully conscious of deciding to be. She went to the door, listened. Vale's voice, low and tight, from the corridor. Get up, now. She opened the door. He was already in motion, his coat on, his satchel over his shoulder, the satchel with the documents, always the satchel, and his face was carrying the expression she'd learned to read over the past 2 weeks, the expression that was not fear because fear was a luxury, and this was something more efficient, pure forward momentum, all weight shifted to the next 30 seconds. How many? She asked. 6 that Davin counted. There may be more on the east side. He was already moving toward the back stair. They're not in crown livery. Which meant Vorath was operating without official authorization. Which meant he had decided that the risk of unofficial action was lower than the risk of allowing the situation to reach the ball. The Queen Mother had told them he would move. She had been right about the timing in the way that someone was right when they had spent 18 years watching a man and knew the specific threshold at which his patience ran out. They came out through the inn's back delivery entrance into an alley that ran between the building and a cooperage, the cold air hitting them after the inn's warmth with the specific shock of a sudden transition. Vale's man Davan was waiting with 2 horses in the alley's shadow, his expression the closed-off efficiency of a soldier who had been in worse situations and was currently managing this one. From somewhere at the inn's front, the sound of a door being forced. They moved. The city was not yet fully awake. The blue-gray light of early morning, the streets carrying only the first thin traffic of delivery carts and early workers, Nobody who would mark 3 people moving quickly through the outer lanes as anything but ordinary urgency. Vale led, Devon behind, Mirelle between them, her hand gripping the scarf at her shoulder out of pure reflex, the embroidered corner under her fingers. They were 3 blocks from the inn when the riders came around the corner ahead. 4 of them, blocking the lane. Not in livery, plain dark coats, nothing identifying. But the way they sat their horses was the way trained men sat horses when they had a specific objective and had position to accomplish it. Vale pulled up. Behind them, Mirelle heard the sound of more hoofbeats, the second group coming from the alley they'd just left, between and ahead and behind. "Devon," Vale said. "I see them," Devon said. The space between the 2 groups was approximately 40 feet of cobblestone lane with a narrow foot alley on the left side too slim for horses. Vale was running it the same way Mirelle was running it, not panicking, but calculating with the specific clarity that arrived when the options narrowed to a number small enough to assess quickly. The nearest rider in front of them held up a hand. "The girl comes with us," he said. "That's the only ask." His voice was professional, flat, a man doing a job. "That's not going to happen," Vale said. "Marshal." The rider's voice carried no particular hostility, the tone of someone presenting terms before moving to the next step. "You don't have the numbers. You don't have the position. Take your man and walk away. This doesn't need to be about you." 11 years. She thought about what Vale had said about Kyle, the specific quality of that silence when Petra had said the name, the 11 years sitting in it. She thought about Mirelle Rowan running through a burning palace with nothing but the decision that this child would survive this night. She thought about the Queen Mother's hand touching the embroidered corner of the scarf, the lightness of it, the 18 years in that touch. She thought about all the people who had positioned themselves between her and harm over the course of her life, most of them without her knowing, most of them paying something real for it. And she thought about the specific moment when a person had to decide whether they were the thing being protected or the thing doing the protecting. She moved before she had fully decided to move. She pulled the scarf from her shoulders and held it up. Not as a gesture, not as theater, but as the specific act of making something visible that had been kept hidden. The embroidered crest facing outward toward the riders, the royal seal of Valedorn catching the morning light. "My name is Mirelle Rowan," she said. Her voice was not loud. She didn't need it to be loud. The lane was narrow, and the silence was sufficient. "I am the lost heir of Valedorn. Every man in this lane is now standing inside a decision that he will answer for in front of the full noble assembly in 6 weeks." She kept her eyes on the lead rider. "Vorath sent you. Vorath answers to no crown authority I recognize. The Crown Marshal behind me answers to one I do." A pause. "Which of those 2 things do you want your name attached to when this is over?" The lane was very quiet. The lead rider looked at the scarf. He was not an unintelligent man. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, reading the crest, reading her face, running the calculation she had given him the pieces of. Behind him, one of the other riders shifted in his saddle. She heard Vale breathe once, a controlled, deliberate breath. The breath of a man who had just watched something happen that he hadn't directed and was reassessing his situation. The lead rider looked at her for 4 more seconds. Then he looked at the man to his left. Something passed between them. Not words, the wordless communication of 2 people who had just arrived at the same conclusion independently. He looked back at Mirelle. "We were given an address," he said. "We found the address empty." A pause. Then he turned his horse. The other 3 turned with him. They rode back around the corner and the sound of their hooves faded and the lane was empty ahead. Behind her, the second group had also gone. She heard them leaving without looking, the clatter of withdrawal, the particular sound of men who had been given an objective that had just become significantly more complicated. Davin let out a long breath. "What the—" "Move," Vale said. But he was looking at Mirelle, and in his face was the expression she'd seen in Orla's room. Not soft, not performed, the specific unguarded response of someone who had just watched a thing happen that had changed their understanding of the situation. She wrapped the scarf back around her shoulders. The embroidered crest settled against her collarbone. She kept walking. They reached the safe house on the western perimeter by mid-morning, a crown property, stone-walled, with a gate that required Vale's seal to open and had two of his most trusted men already inside. Petra was there. She had received word of the morning's encounter through channels Mirelle didn't yet fully understand, and she had the look of someone who had been sitting with several difficult pieces of information and waiting for the people who needed to act on them to arrive. Vorath has filed a formal petition with the Noble Assembly, Petra said, before Vale had his coat off. This morning, he's calling for an emergency session before the ball. Vale set his satchel on the table. On what grounds? Fraudulent claims to royal bloodline. He's naming you specifically, Adrian, claiming you've been misled by a forged documentation trail. He's also claiming the girl, he's named her, is operating in conspiracy with an unidentified foreign interest. Petra's voice was even but carrying something underneath it. He got 3 assembly members to co-sign the petition, enough for a quorum. The emergency session, Vale said. When? 4 days. 4 days. Not 6 weeks. 4 days, which meant that the controlled approach, the ball, the public moment, the full assembly as witness, was no longer the terrain they were operating on. Vorath had changed the terrain. He had done what frightened men did when they felt the ground moving under a structure they'd spent years building. He had stopped managing and started forcing. Vale looked at Mirelle. She was already looking at him. 4 days to stand in front of a hostile assembly with incomplete documentation and a claim that every man in that room who had benefited from 18 years of the previous arrangement would have every incentive to reject. 4 days to make the truth visible in a room full of people whose investment was in keeping it buried. She thought about the lead rider in the lane. I was given an address. We found the address empty. She thought about what it took to make a man choose differently. Not force. She hadn't had force available. Not authority, not the kind they'd recognize. Just the specific weight of consequence made visible. The calculation rendered clear enough that choosing the wrong side of it felt like something. 4 days. The Queen Mother, Mirelle said. She'll be at the emergency session, Petra said. She has no choice. If she doesn't attend, it looks like endorsement of the petition. Then so will I, Mirelle said. The room was quiet. Vale looked at her with the expression she was beginning to understand was his version of the thing other people's faces did more openly. The admission of something, the acknowledgement of a feeling too large and too specific to be named efficiently. If Vorath controls that room, he started. He doesn't control the melody, Mirelle said. He doesn't control the birthmark. He doesn't control what the Queen Mother's face does when she hears it in a room full of witnesses. She held his gaze. He never had control over the truth. He only ever had control over the silence around it. Outside, the capital moved through its afternoon. 4 days away, a room full of men with power and fear and 18 years of investment in a lie was preparing to make that lie official. And in a stone house on the western perimeter, the girl they had buried among the poor was preparing to walk into it. Her hand found the scarf's embroidered corner, the crest under her fingertips. 4 days. The emergency session of the Noble Assembly convened on the 4th morning in the Hall of Accord, a room that had been designed for exactly this kind of moment and knew it, the architecture carrying the specific gravity of a space built to hold consequential things. High stone walls, tall windows giving winter light that fell in cold columns across the assembly floor. Tiered seating for the noble houses, arranged in the horseshoe configuration that placed the presiding chair at the open end and made everyone in the room visible to everyone else. No shadows. No corners. The Hall of Accord had been built to make concealment difficult, and it did its job. Mirelle had stood outside its doors for 30 seconds before entering, not from fear. She had moved past the territory of fear sometime in the previous 4 days, moved through it and come out the other side into something that had no clean name, a state of absolute forward commitment that felt less like courage and more like the simple exhaustion of every alternative. She had been running, managing, calculating, surviving for 18 years without knowing what she was surviving toward. The doors in front of her were the end of the running. Whatever happened on the other side of them, she was done with the direction she'd been moving in and was choosing a different one.
She had stood outside for 30 seconds because she was allowing herself to feel the weight of it, not to be crushed by it, to feel it, which was different. The weight of a thing acknowledged was lighter than the weight of a thing carried without acknowledgement. She had learned this in the small ways over years of service, the way you learn things that nobody taught you directly, that the heaviest burdens were the ones you pretended weren't there. Then she had walked in. Tuon. The room was full. Every major noble house in Valedorn had a representative seated in the tiered rows, and the quality of the attention in the room was the specific quality that came when people with power gathered around a situation that threatened the arrangement of that power. Not unified attention, fractured, the room divided between those who had been briefed by Morith's network and those who hadn't, between those who had a stake in the existing order and those who were waiting to see which direction the wind was moving before committing to a position. Morith sat in the primary petitioner's chair with the composed confidence of a man who had prepared thoroughly and believed his preparation was sufficient. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in political environments, smooth on the surface, everything functional underneath, concealed and organized. He watched Mirelle enter the room with the expression of someone who had accounted for her presence and was not concerned by it. That expression was the most dangerous thing in the room. Vale was already inside, standing to the left of the presiding chair with his crown seal visible and the document satchel over his shoulder, his face carrying the controlled stillness that Mirelle had learned to read as his version of absolute readiness. Devon was at the room's far entrance. Petra was somewhere in the observer's gallery above, which Mirelle didn't look up at because looking up would have been a tell, and she was not giving tells. The presiding chair held Lord Assessor Fenn, the Assembly's senior adjudicator, a man in his 70s whose reputation for procedural impartiality was the thing most people cited when his name came up, and whose face now carried the expression of someone managing a situation he hadn't anticipated and wasn't certain he wanted to be managing. And in the chair reserved for the Crown's senior representative, set apart from the noble tiers on its own platform, sat the Queen Mother. She was wearing formal black. Her white hair was pinned. She sat with the walking staff across her knees, and her pale gray eyes moving through the room with the steady, deliberate attention of someone conducting a final assessment of a situation they had been thinking about for a very long time. She looked at Mirelle when she entered. One look, direct and brief. Then she looked forward. Mirelle took her position at the petitioned party's stand, the floor-level platform at the horseshoe's open end, visible to every person in the room. She set the scarf on the stand's surface. She placed the folded document beside it. She stood straight and put her hands at her sides and waited. Lord Assessor Fenn called the session to order. What? Morith spoke for 20 minutes. He was good at it. That was the honest assessment, and Mirelle held it without flinching because understanding the strength of an opposing argument was not the same as conceding to it. He moved through his case with the fluency of someone who had prepared it over years rather than days. The forged documentation angle, the foreign conspiracy framing, the specific casting of Vale as a well-intentioned instrument of a sophisticated deception. He was careful not to attack Vale's integrity directly, which was smarter than attacking it would have been. He attacked his judgment, his susceptibility to manipulation. The way a man of genuine skill and dedication could be used by people operating at a longer strategic horizon than he was accustomed to. He was persuasive. Several of the faces in the tiered rows were moving in the direction of persuasion. The small adjustments of people whose initial skepticism was being eroded by the weight of a confident, well-organized case. Then Vale presented the documents. He did it without theater, the economy of a man who understood that what he was presenting didn't need embellishment. The original transfer record, the census notation, the relay of provenance through the Crown Archive's own records. He walked the room through each piece with the precision of a man who had spent 11 years constructing cases and knew exactly where the load-bearing points were and how to expose them. Morith challenged each piece. His challenges were prepared. He had seen the contents of the dispatch, he knew what was coming, and he had built counter-arguments in advance that were technically plausible. Not definitive, plausible. The distinction was the space the session was living in, and Mirelle could feel the room calibrating inside that space.
The assembly members weighing technical plausibility against the specific human credibility of what they were seeing and hearing. Lord Assessor Fenn called a procedural pause. Water was brought. People shifted in their seats. In the pause, Morith looked at Mirelle for the first time directly since she'd entered the room. It was not the look he had given her through Selene's household's hierarchy. She had never interacted with him directly there, had only heard him through a partially open door. This was the first time he was looking at her as himself, without the management layer of the proxy he'd operated through for 3 years. What she saw in it was not what she'd expected. Not contempt. Not the cold calculation of a man looking at an obstacle. Something that surprised her precisely because it was so much smaller than everything he'd done to maintain it. Exhaustion. 18 years of maintaining a weight that had started as a choice and had become a load that didn't get lighter with time, only more familiar. The exhaustion of a man who had built a structure and had been maintaining it for so long that he no longer remembered what it had felt like before the maintenance was required. She looked back at him without expression and thought, I almost feel sorry for you. Almost. Then she thought about Mirelle Rowan dying in the eastern marches with nothing to show for the night she'd run through a burning palace except one child delivered safely. She thought about the notation in the document. The melody must not be repeated. The deliberate, cold, calculated decision to silence a lullaby that a woman had died for her to know. She thought about Selene's voice saying she looks like she belongs in a barn, and 3 years of structured diminishment, and every person in every household before that who had looked at her with the specific gaze reserved for things that didn't fully belong anywhere. The almost dissolved. Lord Assessor Fenn called the session back to order. The petition party, he said, has the floor. Mirelle looked at the room. She did not begin with the documents. Vale had made the documentary case and made it well, and adding to it would have been redundancy rather than reinforcement. She did not begin with an argument, because argument invited counter-argument, and she was not interested in conducting her life inside a counter-argument. She picked up the scarf, held the embroidered corner outward so the room could see the crest. My mother's name was Mirelle Rowan, she said. Her voice was level and carried without effort in the hall's acoustics. She was a royal guard. She died in the Eastern Marches 18 years ago, which most of the people in this room already know, because most of the people in this room have known the shape of what happened 18 years ago and have made their own calculations about what to do with that knowledge. She paused. I'm not going to argue with those calculations. I'm going to do one thing, and then the Queen Mother of Valedorn is going to do one thing, and after that, every person in this room can make whatever calculation they choose. She turned to face the Queen Mother directly, and she sang. The Hall of Accord was a room built to hold consequential things, and it held this one. The melody moved through the cold winter light and the tiered seating and the careful watching faces, and it was not a performance. She had never performed it, had never had an audience for it, and the absence of performance gave it the specific quality that performance could not manufacture. It was simply true. The tune her mother had sung her in a place she couldn't picture, taught to her as the most natural thing in the world, as ordinary as breathing, as ordinary as the hand pressed flat against a small back that said, I am here and I will not move. She sang 12 bars. The Queen Mother's face did what it had done in the garden, but uncontained this time, without the pre-dawn privacy, without the stone wall to put a hand against. In front of every major noble house in Valedorn, the armored surface of a woman who had survived unsurvivable things did the only thing that melody had the power to make it do. It opened. Not collapsed, not shattered. Opened. The specific movement of something that had been held shut by a long exertion of will, finally allowed to release. The grief and the recognition and 18 years of held hope moving across her face in the time it took Mirelle to finish the last bar. The room was absolutely silent. Morith stood up. Your Grace, the assembly must note— Sit down, Essen. The Queen Mother's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of something that had been building for a very long time and had finally been given sufficient reason to arrive. Morith sat down. The Queen Mother rose from her chair. She crossed the floor. Slowly, the walking staff, the deliberate movement, and she stopped in front of Mirelle and looked at her for a long moment with those pale gray eyes that had spent 18 years looking at a world from which one specific thing had been removed. "Show me," she said quietly. Mirelle moved the fabric at her shoulder. The Queen Mother looked at the birthmark. She put 2 fingers against it, not lightly this time, the way she'd touched the scarf in the garden, but with the full pressure of a hand confirming a fact. She turned to face the assembly. "I have heard the royal lullaby of Valedorn sung by one person in this room," she said. "I have seen the royal birthmark carried by one person in this room. I have held the royal household seal, which was placed on the swaddling linens of my granddaughter the night she was taken from the palace." Her voice did not shake. "I am the last surviving member of the royal family of Valedorn who was present at that child's birth. My testimony is not a document. It cannot be forged. It cannot be challenged by counter-documentation." She looked at Morath. "You are welcome to try." Morath looked at her. He looked at the room. He was doing the calculation. Mirelle could see it, the final assessment of a man running the numbers on a situation that had moved decisively past the point where his preparation was sufficient. The calculation took approximately 4 seconds. He sat back in his chair and said nothing. Lord Assessor Fenn cleared his throat. The Assembly will recognize," the Queen Mother said, "the crown heir of Valedorn, or it will explain to the people of this kingdom why it chose not to." She paused. "I suggest the former course. The first noble to stand was a man from the eastern houses whose name Mirelle didn't know, an older man, heavy in his chair, who came to his feet slowly with the expression of someone who had been waiting to see which way the current moved and had just received his answer. He inclined his head toward Mirelle. Then a second. Then 4 more in rapid succession, the cascade beginning, the room reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, the way rooms did when the fundamental structure of a situation changed and the people in them had the survival intelligence to adjust. Not everyone stood. 6 members of the assembly remained seated. 3 who had co-signed Morath's petition, and 3 others whose calculations were slower or whose investments in the existing arrangement were deeper. Mirelle looked at each of them without hostility and with the specific quality of attention that said, "I see you and I remember you, and this is not over." It was not a threat. It was the simple acknowledgement of a truth that everyone in the room understood simultaneously. This was the beginning of something, not the end of it. The Hall of Accord was the moment of turn. What came after the turn was the longer work, the real work, the work that couldn't be accomplished in a single room on a single morning, but would require the patient, sustained effort of a person who understood that changing a kingdom was not the same as winning an argument. Mirelle understood this. She had understood it since the storage room in Selene's manor, sitting in the dark with her hand wrapped around the scarf. She had not been prepared for what she was, but she was prepared for the work. 18 years of learning to move through rooms where she was not wanted, of learning to read people and situations, of learning to survive without the resources that made survival comfortable. None of that was wasted. None of it had been preparation for nothing. It had been preparation for this. Morath was arrested in the hall outside the assembly chamber as the session concluded. Vale handled it. He did it without drama. The presentation of the Crown warrant, which he had prepared in the safe house 2 nights prior with the specific thoroughness of a man who had learned not to arrive at a critical moment underprepared, and the 2 Crown guards who had been positioned outside the chamber since before the session began. Morath went without resistance, which surprised some people in the corridor who had positioned themselves to watch and expected something more dramatic. It didn't surprise Mirelle. She had watched him in the chamber when the Queen Mother stood and the assembly shifted. She had watched the calculation conclude and the exhaustion arrive. The specific exhaustion that came at the end of a very long project that had failed at the last stage despite every investment and every precaution. There was nothing left in him to spend on a dramatic exit. He was a man who had been carrying something heavy for 18 years and had just been relieved of it by the worst possible method. She almost felt sorry for him again. She let herself feel it this time, briefly, without guilt. Empathy was not the same as absolution. She could hold both. The understanding of what 18 years of a wrong choice cost the person making it, and the clear-eyed assessment of what it had cost everyone else, without the 2 things canceling each other out. That was not softness. That was the specific precision of someone who had learned the difference between emotions and decisions, and understood that you could feel something fully without allowing it to determine what you did next. Selene Vorath's warrant was filed the same afternoon, sent north by Crown Courier. Mirelle did not watch it being filed. She didn't need to. What? Vale found her that evening on the palace's eastern balcony, the same side as the garden where she'd stood with the Queen Mother in the pre-dawn dark, though the balcony was higher, looking out over the capital's roofscape toward the mountains in the north distance, their peaks white and absolute against the darkening sky. He came and stood beside her, and for a time neither of them said anything, which was a kind of communication in itself. The specific silence of two people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it, and were allowing that fact to simply exist for a moment before the next thing required their attention. "Cale," she said eventually. A pause. "He's been detained. He'll face a Crown inquiry." "What will happen to him?" "I don't know yet." Vale's voice was even, but carrying the specific qualities she'd learned to recognize underneath his evenness. The weight of something that was being held, not suppressed, held in the particular way a person held something they intended to deal with honestly when the right moment arrived. 11 years, that's a long time to be something and then choose to be something else. "People do it both directions," she said. "Choose to be something else. Both directions." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "they do." She thought about what she had been 20 days ago. A servant in a cold manner, carrying something without knowing what it was, moving through rooms with the practiced invisibility of someone who had been taught since childhood to take up no space a person might notice and resent. She thought about what she was now. Not a different person, the same person, with the same history and the same hands and the same lullaby she had always known, just visible. The same person made visible, which changed not what she was, but what was possible. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then, "You walked into a hostile assembly with nothing but a piece of cloth and a melody your mother taught you, and you made them see it." A pause. "You know more about how to do this than you think." She looked at the mountains, the northern peaks, white and permanent. Somewhere behind them was Selene's manor and the storage room and the hearthstone she'd been scrubbing when Vale had walked into the kitchen and looked at her like she was the only real thing in the room. She let herself look at all of it from this distance. Not with bitterness, not with the particular acid that came from prolonged injustice, but with the clean, unflinching assessment of someone who had decided to learn from the totality of it rather than be defined by any single part. The bitterness would have been easier. Bitterness was a structure. It gave you something to organize around, a fixed point, a clear delineation between what you were and what had been done to you. But she had watched what bitterness did to people over 18 years of living inside rooms shaped by it. It kept them in the position they'd been put in. It made the person who had put them there the permanent center of their story. She refused the permanent center. "There are villages in the north," she said, "where Selene's network took from. The trade restrictions, the title manipulations. There are people there who lost things that can be returned." She paused. "That's where I want to start. Not with court politics. With the North. The Assembly will expect a formal coronation process," Vale said. "There are protocols. The protocols will happen," she said. "And while they're happening, I'll be in the North." She looked at him. "Come with me." He held her gaze for a moment, and she watched his face do the thing it had been doing since the kitchen, moving through its careful professional surface into something that lived underneath it. Something that had been accumulating over the 20 days of movement and risk and proximity and the specific intimacy that came from going through something real with another person and finding that they were, at the bottom of it, someone you recognized. "You're not asking me as a Crown Marshal," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." The mountains held their silence across the distance. The capital's evening lights were coming on below them, small, warm points in the dark. The accumulated light of a city that didn't yet know what had happened in the Hall of Accord that morning and would by morning know everything. The word spreading the way words spread in a kingdom when the word was large enough. Through every lane and market and village, north to the mountains and south to the coast, the specific electricity of a story that had finally arrived at its conclusion. Vale said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, just that. Simple, unadorned, the word of a man who had learned that the most honest things didn't require elaborate scaffolding." She looked back at the mountains. She thought about Mirelle Rowan, not as an absence. She had been an absence long enough. She thought about her as a person, a woman with a name and a choice, and a night that had cost everything and had not been for nothing. She thought about the specific kind of love that looked like a decision made under impossible conditions and held all the way through. She thought, "I understand you now. I didn't before, but I do now." She let herself hold that for a moment, the weight of it, which was not light, the texture of it, which was not simple, the fact of it, which was permanent. Then she let it settle into the place inside her where the large things lived, not forgotten, not set aside, but placed where they could be carried without crushing. Paused. 6 weeks later, in the capital square, with thousands gathered in the winter morning, Mirelle Rowan was declared crown heir of Valedorn before the full assembly and the Queen Mother and every foreign dignitary the kingdom could reach in the available time. It was not the moment the kingdom remembered. The moment the kingdom remembered came 3 days after the declaration, when the palace gates, which had been closed to commoners for 20 years, sealed by the accumulation of class and power and the particular architecture of a court that had organized itself around its own preservation, opened. She had ordered it done quietly, without ceremony. No announcement, no formal occasion. The gates simply opened in the morning, and word moved through the city the way word moved. And by mid-morning there were farmers and blacksmiths and merchants' children and 3 shepherds who had walked 6 hours from the nearest village standing in the palace courtyard, looking at the space that had always been on the other side of what they were permitted to cross. Mirelle came out of the palace in a plain coat and met them in the courtyard. "Come inside," she said. "There's food." One of the farmers, an older woman with the weathered hands of someone who had worked cold ground for 40 years, looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the open gate behind her, then back at Mirelle. "You're the one they found," the woman said. "Yes," Mirelle said, "the one who was living like us." "Yes." The woman looked at the palace entrance. She had the expression of someone trying to reconcile 2 things that had been irreconcilable their entire lives, and were now being presented as the same thing. "All right," she said, and walked in. Mirelle stood in the courtyard and watched them come through, the farmers and the children and the blacksmith who kept stopping to look at the ceiling of the entrance hall like he was trying to memorize it. And she felt something she had no name for, something that was not triumph and not satisfaction, something quieter and more foundational than both. She thought about a cold corridor in the east wing of a manor, a pallet between the linen cabinet and the water barrel, the practiced silence of moving through rooms without being noticed. She thought about the specific loneliness of a person who had learned not to want things because wanting things was a luxury that required a future, and she had never been entirely certain she had one. She thought, that girl carried this, the whole time. She didn't know what she was carrying, but she carried it, and that was the thing worth honoring. Not the bloodline, not the crest, not the melody confirmed in a room full of witnesses. The girl who had kept walking through rooms that didn't want her there, who had kept her mother's scarf because it was the only thing she owned that no one had assigned her, who had sat in a locked storage room in the dark and felt, for the first time terrifyingly, seen. That was where this had started. That was where the new thing started too. Vale came to stand beside her in the courtyard as the last of the morning's visitors made their way inside. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They stood in the winter light with the mountains white in the far distance and the open gates behind them and the sound of voices coming from inside the palace, ordinary voices talking about ordinary things in a space that had not held ordinary voices for a very long time. She picked up the edge of the scarf and held the embroidered corner between her fingers one more time. The crest. Her mother's hands had worked this. Somewhere in the history she couldn't fully access, a woman had placed this in her arms and said, "Remember the song," and had spent everything getting her somewhere the song would survive. The kingdom would not be fixed in a morning. She knew that. The corruption that Moraith and Selene's network represented was not a single knot that could be pulled and would unravel cleanly. It was a system, built over years, embedded in the arrangements of power that people had organized their lives around. Pulling it apart would take the sustained work of a person who understood that kingdoms change slowly, and that the only people who ever actually changed them were the ones who were willing to be there for the slow part. She was willing. She had been prepared for the slow part her whole life without knowing it. Every hour she had spent moving through rooms that hadn't wanted her, every task performed without acknowledgement, every small humiliation absorbed and set aside in favor of keeping going. None of it had been nothing. It had been the making of someone who understood, in the marrow, what the slow part felt like, who wouldn't grow impatient with it or try to rush it into something more dramatic because she already knew that the unglamorous, sustained effort was the thing that actually moved the world. The bells of Valedorn began to ring. They rang across the capital and outward, the sound traveling over rooftops and down into the valleys and north toward the mountains where the snow held everything in its cold white permanence. The bells rang for the declaration, for the record, for the formal beginning of whatever came next. But in the courtyard, the girl who had once been invisible stood in the open gate with her hand on an embroidered crest and listened to the bells without performing anything for them, without the face she showed when she needed to be the thing a room required, without the armor she had built and worn and finally, slowly, begun to set down. Just herself. In the cold morning light, alive. The bells kept ringing, the gate stayed open.